I made an unholy deal to save my wife from cancer, but it didn't go as planned. Pancreatic cancer. That's what it's called, the thing that's slowly killing my wife. It doesn't sound so horrifying, does it? Pancreatic? It's the cancer part that's bad, obviously. It's the cancer part that's slowly eating away at my wife, my one true love, relentlessly devouring every part of her until there's just a withering, wheezing stranger left, her tormented gaze begging for it to be over, every fiber of her being aching for death. I'd tried everything up to that point, and I mean everything. You'd be amazed and appalled at the sheer quantity of bullshit snake oil miracle remedy shit you'll find if you just go looking for them. All the healers, shamans, witch doctors, and loathsome charlatans preying on the weak and desperate. But conventional medicine had failed me, failed my wife, and I couldn't find it in me to give up, no matter how much she begged me to. At first glance, the nameless street seemed like just another hoax, a nonsensical ritual pasta designed to amass internet points. But the more I looked into it, the more I came to believe that there had to be some merits to it. Too many identical claims, too many similar experiences, too many vivid descriptions. Coming up empty on all other leads, I decided there'd be no harm in giving it a shot. The nameless street was as simple in its complexity as it was complex in its simplicity. At the end of an unnamed street, look for an abandoned house with a locked basement door. Find a way to get into the basement without breaking the lock. In the room beyond, you'll find 2 chairs facing each other. Make sure to lock the door again. Place 66 candles in a wide circle around the room. At the center, place 1/6 of a candle. When night is at its darkest, light all the candles. Sit down in the chair with the back turned to the door and count loudly to 66 and 1/6. If you get it all right, the devil himself will appear, granting you a single wish in exchange for your soul. Finding the nameless street wasn't easy, but at the same time it wasn't that hard either. I just stumbled upon it, I guess. I went searching every evening after my visit at the hospital. That's the only thing that kept me going. Seeing her wasting away, another fragment of her dying every day. Body, mind, soul, soon there'd be nothing left but memories. I paced the streets tirelessly for weeks, making sure to cover as much ground as I possibly could. Then one night, it was just there. The doctors gave her a month, maybe less. We'd been together since high school, 10 years. Got married as soon as we legally could, sharing dreams of children, a house, a dog, a station wagon, a normal, boring, wonderful life. We were going to grow old together, die together, locked in an unbreakable embrace, exhaling our last breath at the exact same moment. But now she was leaving, fading, and I felt helpless and lost and alone. I needed this. I needed it to be real. It was just like I'd imagined it. A harrowing house at the end of the street, all the windows smashed in, front door missing, exterior graying and faded. A faint smell of urine lingered inside, and the walls were all covered in tasteless graffiti. I didn't care to inspect the house itself. I was there for one thing. I descended the ramshackle stairs leading down to a surprisingly sturdy-looking wooden door and gave the handle a try. Locked. This was the place. When I wasn't at the hospital, Stan was. I didn't even have to convince him. I just wanted someone to be there by her side at all times, and I think he understood that. My brother got along well with my wife, and it seemed like the right thing to do. When I arrived after work, Stan would be there, and we'd talk for a bit. It affected him too, devoured him like it devoured me. He looked older than any younger brother should. I had to fix this, or we'd all just fade to nothingness. I returned the next evening with candles and tools. I had no idea how to pick a lock, but luckily some guy on YouTube did, and after about 30 minutes of finagling and cursing, I heard a soft click, followed by the door sliding open. The basement was just how I'd imagined it too, cramped and damp and dark, 2 chairs placed at the exact center of it. Once I'd made sure the door was locked, I started placing the candles in a wide circle, saving the 1/6 of a candle for last. I sat down on the chair with the back turned to the door and waited, when the night is at its darkest. How can you tell? Isn't night just a lack of light? When the sun is down, isn't it just down? I felt stupid, ignorant, like I'd fooled myself into believing something that'd never work. How could it work? It was utterly ridiculous. But still, I couldn't give up now. I had to try. I owed my wife that much. I started lighting the candles. I figured it wouldn't get any darker, and couldn't very well spend all night in that creepy abandoned shithole. Better to just get it over with. It took a good 5 minutes to get all the candles in the circle lit, and I swallowed deeply before lighting the final one. It didn't feel any different, but I sat down regardless and started counting loudly to 66 and a sixth seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. My voice rang hollow and insincere. I glanced around anxiously while counting, but save for the dancing shadows cast by the flickering candles, there was nothing. 33, 34, 35. Don't you find this hysterically ridiculous? A cheery voice queried from behind me. I suppose I wasn't really expecting anything to happen. Not really. Thus the sudden realization that someone was there behind me caused me to tumble off the chair in shock, and I spent quite some time desperately struggling to get back up. I mean, you must have stopped at 66 and a sixth and gone, wow, this is some next level absurd as shit nonsense, right? He was not what I expected. At all. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, long blonde hair, dressed in jeans and a white hoodie. He smiled widely, emerald eyes sparkling vividly as they scanned the room. All you had to do was ask, he mimicked, holding a phone up to his ear. No need for this unnecessarily elaborate? He paused, waggling his right index finger around theatrically. I want to say ritual? Who are you? I stammered incoherently. Such a useless question, he chuckled. Names have no meaning here. Are you? I staggered back into the wall. Are you the devil? Look, buddy, he grinned widely. It really isn't important. What is important, however, is what I can do for you. He wandered around the room nonchalantly, eyes darting back and forth between the flickering candles and me. He was tall and slim, yet unnaturally imposing, like he could squish me like a bug at any moment if he felt like it. I kept backing into the wall senselessly like a frightened animal. Let's sit, shall we? He beckoned for me to join him as he sat down. We have much to discuss. Jesus Christ, I mumbled. Was this really happening? Nothing about it felt right. It felt unholy, blasphemous. My back scraped against the cold, protruding bricks of the wall, like the pain somehow grounded me to reality. Jesus fucking Christ, I added. Look, you can call me anything you'd like if it makes you feel better. His piercing eyes dug into mine. It really doesn't matter what fantasy you subscribe to. In the end, they're all nothing but lies, and just like names, they only hold meaning to owners and believers. And let's just say I'm neither. Now please just sit, James. You're making this whole satanic deal thingy very awkward for the both of us. How do you know my name? I mumbled, still subconsciously backing into the unmoving wall. He threw his head back and laughed heartily. So you came here ready to summon the literal devil, but you're surprised he somehow knows your name? James? James, you're really out of your depth here. You know that, right? He motioned towards the vacant chair. Sit, James. Sit, and we'll discuss what I can do for Nora. The mention of her name brought me back from whatever delirious state I was in. I suppose I immediately stopped caring whether it was real or not. The end justifies the means. Isn't that what they say? Even if I was hallucinating, even if this was some insanely convoluted hoax, I had to give it a shot. I'd never forgive myself if I didn't at least try. I hesitantly stumbled to the chair and sat down facing the man. How do you know her name? I asked. How can you possibly know any of this? We've been through this, James. I know all I need to know, and that's just how it is. For instance, I know that Nora, sweet darling Nora, is slowly dying from cancer. I say slowly, but that's really not the case anymore, is it? I'd give her maybe a few days, a week at most. Better start making some arrangements. Choose a nice coffin, find a decent plot, organize the service. These things take time, you know. Wouldn't want to half-ass her funeral now, would you? I felt a sudden rush of anger. Anger and resentment and sadness and despair. I wanted nothing more than to just punch his infuriatingly carefree face in, but something deep down inside me told me that would be a horrible idea. Instead, I just broke down crying. Heavy, convulsive sobs. There, James, my boy. It isn't over yet, he smiled. What if I told you I could take it all out of her? The cancer. Just reach into that frail, broken body and rummage around in there until it's all gone. Wouldn't that be something? I stared at him blankly, tears running down my face. Could you do that? I murmured. Could you really do that? I could. He leaned back, hands behind his head. But I'd have to put it somewhere else. Natural order, balance, and all that jazz. But I'll do you a solid since I kinda like you, James. What do you mean? I asked. See, what I do with it, the cancer is entirely up to me. I mean, I could just stuff it in you. And normally I would. I'm a stickler for irony. You know how it goes. You can't live without the love of your life, so you make an unholy deal with some diabolical entity to save her, only to die days later. Hilarious. But since you've grown on me like a tumor, I'll do you one better. What do you say we stick the big C into your worst enemy instead? My worst enemy? Did I even have enemies? I mean, I didn't really like my boss, and my neighbor was incredibly annoying, and truth be told, I could really do without the "you're not good enough for my daughter" attitude from my mother-in-law too. But an enemy? I suppose my coworker, Eric, was the closest thing I had to an enemy. He was demeaning and malicious, always going out of his way to make me look bad. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much I hated him. Yes, I said, do it. There's this guy Eric at my job. Oh, I'm sorry, he interrupted. I think you misunderstood me. I don't need to know who you think your worst enemy is. No, James, my guy, I know who your worst enemy is. I just need a yes and the old handshake to confirm our arrangement. That's all. How do I know you can do it? I suddenly felt a sobering doubt rising. This was all too good to be true, too fucking crazy to be real. How do I know I can trust you? I'm glad you asked, he chuckled. It's smart, to question these things. Sure, I manifested in this locked basement out of thin air, and know more about you and your wife than any random stranger possibly could, but I get it. You need proof. He stood up from the chair and leaned in close to me. I instinctively sank into my seat, desperately trying to avoid his piercing gaze. Now, I would love to say that this wasn't going to hurt. His eyes gleamed eerily in the darkness, but I'd be lying, and truth is everything, isn't it? That's why you're here, for the truth. You might not know it yet, granted, but you will. And who knows, you might even come to thank me one day. What are you trying to say? I swiftly replied. With inhuman speed, he stuck both his hands into my chest. I know it's impossible. Of course I know it's impossible, but the pain was real, and the blood was too. Insufferable pain, like every nerve ending in my body was set on fire. Fountains of blood showered us both, and I felt the sudden presence of an impenetrable darkness. Don't cross over just yet, Jamesy boy, he laughed. We're only just getting started. I could feel him touching me from the inside, fingers digging into tissue and muscle and organs, every little prod bringing insurmountable waves of torment, somehow spreading to every pain receptor at once. I couldn't breathe, so I couldn't scream, but I imagine every synapse in my body lighting up simultaneously to form a hysterical howl. Ah, he licked his lips. There we go. Just the suckers we were looking for. They can be a handful, let me tell you, and all this blood makes it hard too. Takes practice. With a forceful yank, he pulled his hands back, leaving behind a gaping hole in my chest. I should be dead, I thought, as I stared into the mangled depths of my own body. I was convulsing uncontrollably in spasming seizures, but I still managed to get a long, good look at what he was proudly holding in his blood-dripping hands. Recognize them? He laughed. They're called lungs, primarily used for breathing, I've been told. Ugly suckers, though, don't you think? Most of the stuff you find on the inside doesn't look as good on the outside. I guess there's some meaning to it, aesthetics and such. He waved them around playfully, blood squirting everywhere. Every muscle in my body was spasming violently now, and I felt my mind starting to slip, overwhelmed by the unimaginable pain. I'm going to die, I thought. This is it. This is where they'll find me. But just as the alluring darkness was about to overcome me, I was brought back by his cheery voice. So does that do it? He asked, his mouth now inches from my ear. Are you convinced? Do we have an agreement? I tried my best to nod, but I'm not sure you could easily discern the voluntary movements from the involuntary anymore. Blood was flowing in thick streams from the gaping wound on my chest, pouring into an impossibly deep pond on the cold concrete below. Suddenly he grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously. Good lad, he laughed heartily. It's a deal then. I'll yank the nasty tumors from sweet darling Nora and pack your worst enemy full of the stuff. Really can't wait for this one, James. Sounds like an absolute riot. The darkness was closing in, and I felt some manner of peace as a thick blanket of heavy tiredness enveloped every part of my being. I'll be on my merry way then, he said. People to meet and eat, you know how it goes. I could hear him walking towards the door, heavy steps echoing through the room, too heavy for his lithe frame. Everything was turning black now, and I suppose I was mere seconds away from passing out and on when his voice brought me back once more. Oh, right, I forgot, he chuckled. You probably need these. Mind-numbing pain shot through my body as he pushed his hands into the wound again, brutally rummaging around in there for what felt like ages. Then, with a sudden yank, he was out again. There you go, he said. Good as new. Keep those suckers clean now, you hear? Stay away from cigarettes and huffing asbestos. He laughed. Anyway, be seeing you, James. I have a feeling we'll talk again real soon. And with that, he was gone. I was left slumped over my chair, wheezing and spasming for minutes before realizing I was completely fine. I refused to believe it at first. I examined my chest thoroughly, every inch of it, then turned my attention to the floor. Not a drop of blood, not so much as a paper cut on my chest. It was like it had never happened. But it did, didn't it? The pain was so real, so horribly, gruesomely real. Minutes of excruciating torture that felt like years, and then nothing. I didn't stick around to question what had happened. I got out of that basement in a panicky haze and never looked back. When I got home, I immediately collapsed on the couch and slept for 12 hours straight. I'm sure I would have slept longer, probably days, maybe a week, but I was ripped from my deep slumber by the sound of my phone. Yeah, I mumbled. Who's this? James, Stan shouted excitedly. You're not going to believe this. It's a fucking miracle. A miracle. Even the doctors agreed. There was just no medical explanation for Nora's sudden recovery. No rational way to describe how the cancer had just vanished. Poof, not a trace left in her. A miracle, they all agreed. Deep down, I knew that wasn't the case, of course. It wasn't miraculous at all. In fact, it was probably the exact opposite. But I didn't care. I was just so happy she was still here, still alive, still breathing. I've never cried like I cried that day. Tears of joy. Who knew such a thing could be real? Weeks went by, and that night in the basement slowly faded from memory. I guess I just went with it, you know. Pretended it was all some vivid hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and desperation and grief. And when Eric didn't get horribly sick and die like I'd secretly hoped, I just let it all go. Life moved on. Except it didn't. It all stopped in that basement. Maybe not stopped, but perverted. Grew out of control, like cancerous cells. My wife sat down with me a month later. We need to talk, she said. I could tell by the look on her face that it wasn't anything good. There were tears, lots of them, crocodile and otherwise, and a pained, guilt-ridden expression. She wanted a divorce, she told me. She'd been seeing another man for quite some time now, but because of the cancer and her imminent death, she didn't have it in her heart to tell me. But now that she was healthy and had her life back, she wanted to move on, wanted to find happiness again. Who? I remember yelling. Who the fuck is he? It's your brother, she sniffled pathetically. It's Stan. I suppose my life ended there. Betrayal comes in all shapes and sizes, but from my own brother, my own flesh and blood, it was too much to bear. And I guess I felt it already then. The hate, that seething anger and fury and resentment, consuming every fragment of my existence from there on out. She moved out the same day, packed her shit, and went to live with my brother. I sat in the darkness of my trashed living room for days, fueled and fed by nothing but bubbling detestation and loathing and hatred. I wanted to burn him alive, nail him to the wall, dig out his eyes with a rusty knife. He was already dead to me, but I wanted him dead to the world too, my worst enemy. And then, like clockwork, he got diagnosed with cancer. Pancreatic, such a beautiful word, rolls right off the tip of your tongue. Pancreatic. Instant and terminal. My brother died days after they first caught it. It spread faster than anything they'd ever seen, they told me. A reverse miracle of sorts. I cried no tears at the funeral. I don't think I'll ever cry again. Nora couldn't deal with his death. Her sudden recovery followed by the hope of a new life with a new love, smothered instantly by cruel, hideous irony. She hung herself in Stan's garage a week later. I tried to cry at her funeral. I really did, but it was all empty. Hollow and void. A soulless husk. There was this moment after they'd lowered her coffin, a brief second of serene silence. No birds, no grieving masses, no wind, just a perfect moment of tranquility. I could hear him clearly then, in the back of my mind. A cheery chuckle, a hearty laugh. I have a feeling we'll talk again real soon. Just like the uncontrollable growth of abnormal cells, the amassing sum of my sins spread to cover every aspect of my existence. There is no miracle, reverse or otherwise, waiting for me at the end of the line. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is no end to the tunnel. There is no end. As I stare into the fathomless depths of my empty void soul, I can only nod and agree. When I see the pale, faceless dancer, I know somebody is about to die. I've seen her 5 times, and every time someone I know ended up dead within hours. I say her, but I'm really not sure if that's even remotely accurate. She has the graceful, elegant, limber movements of a woman, and even though her physique is completely androgynous in nature, I still feel more comfortable imagining her as a woman for some reason. The first time I saw her, I had to be around 5 or 6. The ritual is always the same. I wake up in the pitch blackness, unable to move a muscle. Then a slowly growing pale, pulsating cyst will appear in the periphery of my vision, eventually birthing the dancer in violent, horrible contractions. She will climb out, pale, tall, and spindly, completely hairless. But what really disturbs me is the face, or lack thereof. I can sort of see the cavities under the thin skin, the flickering movement of her eyes under there, or the way she opens and closes her veiled mouth. She will stand there in the periphery for a while, gently swaying side to side, before she starts dancing. I guess the closest I can come to describe it would be a disturbing version of ballroom dancing. She moves gracefully, mimicking holding her partner, gently floating back and forth, her head constantly turned in my direction. I can see her mouth moving under that pale, translucent skin, like she's trying to tell me something, but she never makes a sound. When the unheard music stops, she will too. She would have moved across the room now, usually standing by an exit, either a window or a door. She will continue to move her unseen mouth for a little while, before she slowly fades and becomes one with the darkness. At this point, I can choose to wake up. I've only done it twice, the very first time it happened, and the last time it happened. It's not that something horrible happened that first time I woke up. I think it was more the feeling that she hadn't really left, that she was still there somehow, unseen, hidden just beyond the veil. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. So I climbed back into bed and hid under the covers, shaking and crying. The next morning we got word that our neighbor had passed away. She was a sweet old lady, Mrs. Barrow, died of a heart attack. They said she went peacefully, but I'm not so sure about that anymore. I didn't make the connection back then. How could I? I was barely old enough to understand the finality of death, let alone tie it to a pale, faceless nightmare. But then it happened again, 5 years later, the same ritual, the same faceless creature, the same dance. I didn't wake up this time, however. I just slipped back into the comforting, warm darkness of sleep, and I woke up to my mom crying. My grandmother had died. They didn't tell me how until a few years later. She'd drowned in her bathtub, fallen asleep, or had an episode or something, just collapsed and drowned. 2 years later, my uncle died after I was visited by the faceless dancer. Car accident. Must have fallen asleep at the wheel. His body was crushed, mangled, unrecognizable. They had to pick up pieces of him for days. Horrible thing. Now I was old enough, though. Old enough to spot the pattern, to question what the faceless dancer really represented. Was it death? A portent of doom? An omen of unrest? Or something else? Something vile and sinister? A horrible, taunting defiler? Or was it just a messenger? Merely a bringer of bad news? I didn't know, and I didn't really care to know. When I was 17, I saw her for the 4th time. This time the dance seemed more intense, more violent, like the unheard music moved in sudden bursts of extreme rhythms. Her face remained still, however. Even when her body warped and twisted and turned, the face was motionless, fixated on me. I woke up crying, trembling, dreading the news I knew was coming. My mom was hysterical, torn up, in shambles. My dad had died on his way home from a business trip. His plane had some technical problems and had to make an emergency landing. When the cabin crew went around to check if everyone was all right, they found my father dead. He'd somehow got entangled in the seat belt, suffocating as the plane made its unplanned landing. It was ruled a freak accident. Look, I know what you're thinking. Well, I know what half of you are thinking. Why don't I tell someone? Why don't I warn them? Do something? Short answer is I've tried. I've tried to tell someone, but they always look at me like I'm either delusional or some sick freak. I've lost friends because of it. My mom refused to listen to me and more or less disowned me when I told her about it. No one will take me seriously. And I don't blame them. For the longest while, I didn't even believe it. Just some crazy hallucination caused by sleep paralysis or something. The deaths, coincidences. Nothing more. I convinced myself of this, and it worked too, for 15 years. Never saw her, never felt her. It was all in my head, some shitty psychotic episode or mental breakdown or something. I was free. Until a week ago. It started like all the other times, a pulsating pale cyst, leathery and disgusting, throbbing in the periphery. Then she clawed her way out, following the repulsive rhythms of the contractions. She climbed out slowly, rose to her spindly feet, stood there swaying side to side, started the graceful dance, her face always fixated on me. Back and forth, her skin-covered mouth moving, forming unheard sentences. She elegantly made her way across the room and slowly faded away. But I wouldn't have it. Not this time. No one was going to die because of me ever again. My husband was sound asleep next to me. I'd never told him about the pale dancer, and I never will. My kids were in the next room, Noah and Trinity. I couldn't risk them. I couldn't risk her hurting any of them. So I forced myself awake. Trembling and sweating, I got up and slowly crept to the last place I'd seen her, the door. I don't know quite how to explain it, but there was this residual presence, like an echo of her being. It lingered wherever she'd physically been present, but I felt it stronger where I had last seen her. I opened the door and slowly made my way to the kids' room. I didn't feel her there, but she was close. I turned around and immediately let out a hoarse whimper and stumbled back in shock. She was there, at the end of the hallway, still dancing, still moving, still mouthing soundlessly towards me. Then she suddenly disappeared around the corner. I swallowed deeply and thought for a second about waking up John, my husband, but I still couldn't risk it. This was something I had to face alone, so I followed her. When I turned the corner, she was halfway down the stairs. Her face was still following me wherever she turned, always fixated on me. My heart was pounding. I was sweating and trembling like a leaf, my mind filled with all the potential gruesome conclusions to this horrendous game of cat and mouse. But I had to know what it meant, so I kept following her. Down the stairs, into the living room, out into the hallway. And then she stopped. She'd reached the door and just stood there completely motionless. Her mouth wasn't moving anymore either. It was like she was frozen in place. Then she faded again. Without thinking, I fumbled open the lock and threw open the door. She was still there, now standing in the middle of the street. She was dancing again, but in jarring, erratic fashion, her limbs completely out of sync, her head bending in extreme, unnatural angles. "Stop it!" I suddenly yelled hysterically. She stopped, just like that. I moved closer to her, stepped out the door, over the threshold, and as soon as my body had left the house, she was standing right behind me. I could feel her cold breath on my neck, her spindly hands on my shoulders. I turned around in shock, and I screamed. Her mouth was open, a bloody, gaping wound, the fleshly skin flapping disgustingly as her hoarse, croaking voice penetrated my ears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for leaving." She stepped into the house and the door slammed shut. I freaked out, completely lost it. The door wouldn't budge, and I couldn't even imagine what was going on in there. Who she was taking from me this time. I banged and clawed and kicked the door before I finally came to my senses, found a rock, and threw it through one of the windows. The glass shattered instantly, the shards spreading everywhere. I cut myself badly as I clumsily stepped through it. I raced up the stairs. I've never felt fear like that. Never. The mere thought of anyone hurting my kids sent tremors of terror, horror, rage, and sadness, all mixed into a hurricane of unending distress. I more or less kicked the kids' door open, only to find both of them sound asleep. Then I heard the screams coming from my bedroom. Our bedroom. Bestial screams, screams of utter torment. No! I yelled as I stumbled down the hallway and into our bedroom. She was perched atop my husband, her face still turned to me, but this time she had a horrible, fleshly, bloody smile on that otherwise featureless visage. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. Then she faded, gone in an instant, vanished. John's eyes were bulging out, his tongue swollen and blue, sticking out between his clenched teeth. His face was purple, but soon turned pale and lifeless. They say he went quickly, but I know better. I know the endless torment he must have endured. Brain aneurysm, they told me. Could happen to anyone. Bad luck. There's no such thing as bad luck around me. Only the pale, faceless dancer, and the promise of death. All I wanted was to kill my father, but what I found in his cellar made me question everything I believe. All I wanted to do was to kill my father. Torture him horribly, poke out an eye, cut off a finger, pull out some toenails, slice open his abdomen. Simple, straightforward stuff like that. God knows he had it coming. He was a fucking prick every minute of my shitty existence, and it was about time he owned up to it. It was about time he paid. He was a rich prick, too. Fucking asshole fell backwards into a fortune after my sister was born. Some estranged uncle no one had ever heard of went belly up and left everything to him. He never told us how much he inherited, but it had to be millions. Kept every penny to himself after my mom died. Well, he did send my sister to college, I guess. I'll give him that. Keep the toenails. For now. I wasn't killing him for the money, though. I knew I would never see a cent of that fortune. I just wanted him gone, wiped from the face of the planet, forgotten. I'd spent my entire youth trying to be good enough for him, trying to make him proud, but all he did was belittle my every fucking attempt. At some point I got sick of it and took off. Stayed in touch with my sister, though. She said he'd have me disinherited. Removed my name from every official document, like I fucking cared. Life didn't turn out like I imagined, and I strongly believe I can blame everything on my father. It started with him, and I wanted it to end with him. Fuck me, I'm getting agitated just thinking about it. Even when my sister was sick, he acted like I was the problem. When she got better, it was because of him. Not the doctors, not mom, not me, not the family. No, it was all him. Some sort of messed up, perverted messiah complex. I didn't plan it, I just got really drunk one night, and I guess decades of pent-up anger and frustration needed a release. Years of buried guilt and self-doubt bubbling to the surface. So I grabbed whatever I could find. Knives, pincers, crowbar, gasoline, tape, fucking plastic tarp, got in my car, and headed for his ugly-ass mansion 4 towns over. It was a 3-hour drive, but I had plenty of burning hatred to fuel the trip. You know how these things go. You start imagining every scenario in your mind, planning every possibility, every angle, how you're going to act in a given situation, how to handle whatever comes your way, which toenail to pull out first. But there was one constant I could never get around. My sister. I knew she'd be there. What should I do if she intervened? If she got in the way? I didn't want to hurt her, but I desperately needed him to die, and no one could convince me otherwise. It was 3 a.m. at night when I parked about half a mile from my father's house. I couldn't risk waking him, so I decided to walk the final part and come at the property from the forest, to make sure I wasn't spotted by the odd nighttime neighbor. I could feel the adrenaline slowly starting to fill my system as I approached the house. I hadn't been there for ages, but I knew he kept a hidden key under the hideous cherub statue by the porch. Him being the clumsy prick he was, I tipped the statue carefully, and sure enough, there it was. "Stupid fucker," I whispered under my breath. I swiftly made my way to the back door, unlocked it, and snuck in. I don't know what it was, but I immediately got the feeling something wasn't right. Sometimes you'd get these vague premonitions or something a knot in your stomach, but this one made every hair on my body stand on end. It was a deep sense of depravity and disorder, sacrilege and desecration. I'd never felt anything quite like it. Still wanted to murder him, something fierce though, so I pushed everything else aside and crept around the corners stealthily. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor, my sister's on the 3rd, so I was desperately trying to figure out how I should proceed. That's when I noticed the light coming from his study. Maybe he was still awake? A macabre murder in the study? Ageless classic. I edged my way into the study soundlessly, only to succumb to utter disappointment when I found it empty. He'd just forgotten to turn the lights off, I guess. I sighed and turned to the stairs when I suddenly felt a draft. There were no windows in the study, so quite puzzled by this fact, I decided to give it a more thorough search. Once again, I felt the tug of something dark and ungodly, like there was a blasphemous energy pulling me towards the bookcase at the far end of the room. I quietly obeyed and wandered towards the massive mahogany thing. There was something about it, though, something incredibly cheesy. I mean, it's like the most cliché thing ever, isn't it? The hidden room behind the bookcase. I stared at the books for a while. It was just so obvious, so fucking stupid. Every one of those books looked pristine, untouched, except for one. I pulled it. I was kind of expecting a whole show, like the thing was going to shake violently and slide elegantly along a railroad track or something. But all that was heard was a barely audible click, and it just swung open, revealing a winding staircase leading down. I'm not sure I got time to truly feel the disappointment before the full force of the stench entered my nostrils. It was noticeable in the draft, but now it was overwhelming. A sickly, pungent, rotten smell. What in God's name did my father hide down there? A fucking mausoleum of decomposing carcasses? Some kind of murder chamber? Torture cellar? I covered my nose and started descending the winding stairs, guided only by the faint light of my phone. It didn't take long to reach the bottom of the staircase, but every second was spent wishing I was somewhere else, anywhere else. The smell reached levels of unbearable I didn't know existed, and I was constantly dreading what I'd find down there in the horrid shithole abyss. But nothing, I mean absolutely fucking nothing, could have prepared me for that sight. The moment I realized what I was looking at, I fell to my knees, sobbing inconsolably, retching my guts out, banging my head on the concrete floor, tormented down to my very core by the utter violation. The creature was humanoid, a fair bit taller maybe. Chained to the floor, heavy shackles on feet and arms, it lay face down, naked on the cold, rough ground. It was thin, lethargic, gruesomely malnourished and abused. Its skin was ashen gray in complexion and ridden by plague-like infections and boils, horrid deep scars and lacerations. A thick, foul, piss-yellow liquid seeped from the wounds, forming stomach-churning pools by the thing's blackened and gangrenous sides. It wheezed and coughed sickly, still somehow alive, still somehow breathing. But what really sent tremors of dread and horror and disgust through my body was the two horrid, misshapen growths on its back. A pair of utterly revolting underdeveloped wings. It was an angel, a fucking angel. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't stomach it. I don't know how long I sat there staring at my own puke, but to be honest, I had no idea what to do. But it did. I could hear it inside my head. I don't think it could talk. I don't think it had a language. Somehow it could just inherently communicate, soul to soul, mind to mind. And the message was crystal clear. Kill me. It showed me everything. All those years in an instant. A single flash in my mind. How my father had captured it, bound it, tortured it for his own gains. Wealth, sex, perversions. Every vile, despicable, inhuman thing you could imagine. Whips, daggers, needles, fire, cold. All instruments my father wielded to get what he wanted from that poor creature. I didn't need to think about it. I'm no fucking saint, no Mother Teresa, but I knew in that instant what was right, what was merciful. I gripped my knife tightly, stood over the creature, staring into its endless, tormented gaze, grabbed it by the hair, and slit its throat from ear to ear. I knew that wasn't enough. I knew I needed to sever the tie, cut off the head, so I sliced and sliced and sliced. "What the fuck have you done?" my father suddenly shrieked. I could feel the creature fading, gently slipping into the beyond. I grinned in utter satisfaction. "I've taken away your piggy bank," I laughed. "You're a fucking nobody again now." I bathed in the heavenly glow of my father's fatalistic misery. It was glorious, beautiful. "No," he collapsed on the floor, tears streaming from his eyes. "You don't understand. What have you done?" I laughed again. I couldn't keep it in. It was just so perfect. Better than killing him. So much better. The utter torment and suffering he must have felt right then. It tasted so sweet. It tasted like victory. I just didn't expect it to turn sour so quickly. "Dad," my sister's voice called from the darkness. "Dad, I'm not feeling so good." My sister limped into the chamber. She was pale and sweaty, and her face looked worn and tired. She looked so thin, so malnourished, so sick, drained, dying. Her eyes were filled with dread. What's happening? What's happening to me? She took a single step in my direction, almost close enough for one final embrace. But all I could do was stare in disbelief as she collapsed before me, falling face down on the floor. That sound, that horrible sound of her head cracking open, I can't describe it. One final inhale. You killed her, my father sobbed. You removed her lifeline. One final exhale, and she was gone. I've been stalking young women weekly for 3 years, but I think the tables have turned. Look, I'm not proud of what I do. For the longest time, I even told myself I wasn't doing it, stalking young women at night. I was just wandering around, minding my own business. If there so happened to be a young, vulnerable woman walking ahead of me, I could hardly be blamed for that, right? It was just a coincidence that she took the exact same turns as I was going to, crossing the street at the exact position I was planning to. All coincidental. And what if I stopped and retreated into the shadows when she turned around anxiously? What of it? I just didn't want to be seen as all. She might think I was a stalker or something. It's called self-delusion, I guess. A failure to recognize reality. But at the same time, I'm not doing anything wrong. Not really. It's not like I'm planning to harm them. I'm not some sexual predator or anything. Is it even sexual? If so, I'd label it a sexual deviancy, not a perversion. I just enjoy the adrenaline rush, the knowledge that I am in control, the exhilarating feeling of power. When I've reached that high, I just turn around and head back home. No harm, no foul. I've been at it for almost 3 years now, so you could say I'm quite experienced in the field. When I first started out, I was clumsy and stupid, often making myself seen and heard way too early, choosing targets in my own neighborhood, sometimes even targets I knew. I'm a fast learner though, so now I take the train a couple of towns over, spend the evening there doing my thing, then take the train right back home. I'll switch it up as often as I can. Never the same town twice in a week. I keep extensive updated records of restaurants and bars, of which hosts most of my prime targets, and will sit for hours canvassing a place before I choose. But I won't move on just anyone, on any evening. The night must be right. It was a night just like that when I saw her. Late autumn, windy, very dark, no rain. I had been wandering around the block for hours, by then almost ready to give up, when I saw them leaving the restaurant. A first date. Had to be. That awkward hug, anxious small talk, something in her eyes telling me she really wasn't that interested. The guy seemed miffed and flustered when they parted ways. I followed her from across the street. The first few minutes are always interesting. They don't suspect anything yet. They feel safe and in control. Doesn't matter if they see you then. You're just someone walking, minding their own business, all the way on the other side of the street. Harmless. She glanced over a couple of times, and I decided it was time to disappear. Retreat into the shadows. I held back for a little while, and when she disappeared around a corner, I counted to 10 before I followed after her. Just as I crossed the street, though, I was surprised to see him. The date. It seemed they didn't part on the best of terms. You could tell by that aggressive walk that he was up to no good. He disappeared around the corner after her, and I suddenly found myself hesitating. Was this really my business? I could just turn around, head home, and think nothing of it. I hadn't done anything wrong after all, and even if I followed them, what could I do? The guy was twice my size. He'd probably crumple me up like a piece of paper without breaking a sweat. But I do have a conscience. Reading this, you might just think I am some weirdo stalker loser, but I swear I'm a pretty decent guy. A real gentleman, too. I'll have you know. Holding doors for women and all that, giving them roses on Valentine's. I have nothing but respect for women is what I'm saying. I bit my lip nervously and quickly paced across the street after them, not knowing what the hell I was getting myself into. But I figured it was the right thing to do. And maybe I didn't even have to get involved at all. Maybe it was all some silly misunderstanding. I knew the place well. I'd canvassed the neighborhood thoroughly, and I'd taken a mental note of the park. I usually don't like working in parks, too many perverts and weirdos, but this one seemed well lit and easily traversable. I caught up to them after about a minute and silently crouched down behind a tree. It sounded like a heated debate, but only the guy seemed to be talking. Couldn't quite make out what he was saying, but he seemed real agitated. I don't know if it was the sudden explosion in the lamppost above me, the horrible wail echoing through the park, or maybe it was the blood squirting in a straight line past me, but I suddenly felt really vulnerable. I'd failed to assess the situation correctly, and know I was the one in danger. He could probably break my neck in a second, I kept thinking. I glanced nervously around the tree and had to quickly cover my mouth with my hand to avoid screaming. I can't tell you what she was. Not human, that's for sure. It was dark, though, so my eyes might have been deceiving me, but I swear could see fangs and claws and skin stretched unbelievably thin over an impossibly tall, lanky, pale figure. The guy was down. I could see the blood pumping rhythmically from the gaping wound on his throat. She reached down and grabbed his face, and then I ran, bolted down the path I came from, never once looking back. But I could feel her following me, though. Feel her eyes on me. A hungry, merciless, terrible gaze. Adrenaline pumped through my body, but I didn't feel good. Didn't feel the excitement I was so used to, and I was definitely not in control anymore. I made it to the train station in one piece, horrified and exhausted. I considered calling the cops, leaving an anonymous tip or something. But nothing is really anonymous these days, is it? There's always a way to find you. So I didn't. I chickened out and took the first train back home. I couldn't sleep for weeks. That face, that thing haunted me in my sleep. So I did what I do best. I went out in the evenings, found myself a young woman, and did my thing. It was soothing being back in control, helped keep the creeping paranoia at bay. I never went back to that particular neighborhood, though. Not even that particular town. Just couldn't risk running into her again. Anyway, I kept this up for a month, a few nights a week, maybe 2 or 3, and I guess I soon just forgot about it. I mean, honestly, I didn't, but I tricked myself into believing I did. Self-delusion, I guess. I was still checking the news every day for any mention of a headless, mutilated body, but nothing ever came close to matching that particular description. And I'd soon find out why. I was just returning from a wonderful night. I'd followed this young lady for 30 minutes, and near the end I could practically feel her feeling me. She started walking at a rapid pace, taking swift turns, halfway jogging around corners. I kept it up until she started running. That was my cue to head on home. I don't think anything was different. I mean, looking back at it, everything was normal. I arrived at my apartment a little later than usual, maybe 2 to 3 a.m., and locked myself in without noticing anything out of the ordinary. Walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, put away the contents of my backpack, sat down on the couch, and stumbled back in shock, shrieking hysterically like a little child. It was placed neatly on top of my living room table, the stench of it suddenly all too real, covered in hundreds of writhing, disgusting maggots. His eyes were gone, just hollow, empty holes. His mouth was open, tongue stretched down to his chin. It was the guy, the date. In the foul, fetid pond of blood now completely covering the table, there was a note, a white piece of paper just floating around in it. I felt bile rising rapidly to my throat as I read the crimson message. "You're next," is all it said. "You're next," is all that was written on this tiny piece of paper. Fuck me. I guess I really had it coming. I'm an ophthalmologist, and I saw something inexplicable in my patient's eye. "Anna, can you room the next patient?" I asked, glancing up from my notes. "Sure, she'll be in room 5, she replied, heading down the hallway. I quickly reviewed the patient's history that Anna had written up. The lady had been complaining of a haze that seemed to come and go and occasional stabbing pains in her left eye that began several days ago. Nothing way out of the ordinary, really. It was probably just a combination of floaters and dry eye. In my mind, the diagnosis was already locked and loaded, but just out of precaution, the patient was dilated to make sure there wasn't anything going on with her retina. Satisfied with my guess, I took off my readers, picked up my laptop, and entered room 5. "Mrs. Myers, it's good to meet you. I'm Dr. Ronald." "It's nice to meet you too," she replied, her voice tense. Mrs. Myers was a young lady, her hands clutching her handbag in the exam chair. her eyes hidden behind a pair of sunglasses far too large for her face. "Sorry for the sunglasses, Doc. Since yesterday, my eyes have been really sensitive to light." Faint alarm bells started to ring in my head, but I pushed the thought aside for now. "Oh, it's no problem. Why don't you tell me a little more about what's been going on with your eyes?" I asked, trying to sound reassuring. "Well, it's just my left eye, really. Since Saturday, I feel like my vision's been getting worse, like a fog's been building up. And I get these shooting pains from time to time. It almost feels like someone is poking my eye from the back. I had lunch with a friend on Friday who had similar symptoms at the time. I was wondering if it's a weird form of pink eye or something. Could be. How about let's take those sunglasses off and we'll get a look at what's going on with your eye?" "Oh, of course," she said, removing the oversized sunglasses. Under the slit lamp, her eyes seemed normal enough, with the exception of her left eye being somewhat bloodshot. With no clear explanation for her symptoms, I took out my fundus lens and peered into the back of her eye. I had caught no more than a glimpse of her retina before she shrieked and slapped the lens, knocking it rattling onto the floor. But even without that abrupt interruption, I would have dropped the lens in shock. In that brief, horrifying instant, I saw something that defied all logic. Her optic nerve was a pitch-black void, an abyss that seemed to swallow light itself. The optic nerve usually looks like a donut, with a dark orange outer ring surrounding a brighter inner circle. The inside of Mrs. Myers's optic nerve was pure darkness. A perfect little black circle, almost like a miniature black hole, had manifested in the back of her eye, absorbing all light passing into it. As my mind spun in a whirlwind of confusion, Mrs. Myers tumbled from her chair, collapsing onto the floor with a shriek that pierced the air. She clutched her hand over her eye, her voice rising in a crescendo of panic. Just then, Anna burst into the room, snapping me out of my stupor. We rushed to her side, dropping to our knees to help Mrs. Myers. She was inconsolable, moaning and rocking back and forth, her distress palpable. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," she wailed, her voice cracking with terror. "There's something moving in my eye!" As her screaming reached an unbearable climax, Mrs. Myers suddenly looked up from her prostrated position. Her hand was still cupped firmly over her eye, but now we could see the blood trickling down between her fingers, a crimson stream staining her pale cheek. My heart pounded in my chest. I watched in horror. Something was moving beneath her skin, forcing her fingers apart from the inside. The sight was grotesque, a nightmarish struggle playing out just beneath her flesh. With a final blood-curdling scream, Mrs. Myers collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Her arms fell limply to her sides, revealing the true extent of the horror. Jet black, spider-like appendages erupted from her eye, each one glistening with a wet, otherworldly sheen. They waved and writhed, searching for a grip on the slick linoleum tiles. Each movement left behind bloody scratches on Mrs. Myers's face, the lines of red contrasting starkly with her ashen skin. The appendages moved with a life of their own, a ghastly spectacle of wriggling limbs that defied all logic and understanding. The room was filled with the sickening sound of their scraping against the floor, mingling with the faint, gurgling moans that escaped Mrs. Myers's lips. The sight was more than I could bear, a vision straight from the depths of a fevered nightmare. Anna and I immediately fled the room, leaving Mrs. Myers's twitching body and the ever-growing appendages writhing in a pool of blood on the floor. The next few hours were a disorienting blur. The police arrived, sealing off the clinic. Soon after, men in black suits took over, their presence cold and methodical. Anna and I were separated, each placed in stark white rooms and interrogated, forced to recount every harrowing detail of what we had witnessed. The questioning was relentless, and it felt as though we were trapped in a loop of terror, reliving the nightmare over and over. Finally, we were released, but only after signing hefty non-disclosure agreements. I'm writing this in the bedroom now. I know I signed the NDA, but somebody needs to know. The idea of returning to work seems impossible. I think I'll take some time off, perhaps go fishing, or finally make a dent in the Netflix watch list I've been building up. But first, I need to take some Tylenol for this shooting headache behind my eyes.